In the winter of 1942, at a secret research facility on the Baltic coast of Germany, the same team of engineers was quietly working on two weapons at once. One of them was designed to kill people in London. The other was designed to protect people in Berlin. Only one of them would ever be fired in anger. The facility was Peenemünde, and the engineers working there, led by a young physicist named Werner von Braun, were already deep into developing the A-4 rocket, the weapon that would later become infamous as the V-2, a ballistic missile built to rain down on English cities with no real way for anyone below to stop it. But by 1942, as British and American bombers began pounding German cities with increasing frequency, the same team was also sketching out something very different. They called it Wasserfall, meaning waterfall, and unlike the V-2, it wasn't built to attack anyone. It was built to shoot enemy bombers out of the sky before they could drop a single bomb on German soil. Wasserfall was, on paper, remarkable. A supersonic, radio-guided rocket, small enough to be aimed directly at an approaching bomber formation, capable of intercepting aircraft flying at altitudes that conventional anti-aircraft guns simply couldn't reach. It used many of the same guidance and propulsion breakthroughs the team had developed for the V-2, just scaled down and repurposed for defense instead of offense. Test firings began in 1943, and by the time the program wound down, engineers had launched 35 of them, refining the design with each attempt. It was, in every meaningful sense, the world's first guided anti-aircraft missile, and it never shot down a single plane. Not because the engineering failed, but because of where it sat on a list of priorities. The V-2 program consumed enormous amounts of fuel, skilled labor, and Hitler's personal attention, since a weapon that could strike London carried an emotional and propaganda value that a purely defensive system never could. Wasserfall was left competing for scraps of the same limited resources, and it never received the funding or the industrial push it needed to reach mass production before the war ended. One of the program's own lead engineers, Walter Thiel, was killed in an Allied bombing raid on Peenemünde itself in 1943, a bitter detail that captures the whole situation better than any statistic could. The very raids Wasserfall was designed to stop were killing the people trying to build it, while the resources that might have finished the job kept flowing toward a rocket meant to punish London instead of protect Berlin. By the time Germany surrendered in 1945, Wasserfall existed only as an unfinished prototype, a working idea that never got to prove itself where it mattered. But an idea doesn't have to be finished to matter. It just has to survive long enough for someone else to pick it up. Interestingly, the country that would actually finish the job hadn't been waiting on Germany to show them how. As early as January 1945, months before the war in Europe even ended, the United States Army Chief of Ordnance authorized Bell Telephone Laboratories to study something strikingly similar to Wasserfall, a complete, workable guided missile capable of shooting down high-speed, high-altitude aircraft. The request came directly out of American observation of German advances in jet propulsion and rocketry during the war, a recognition that conventional anti-aircraft guns were about to become obsolete against the next generation of bombers, guided or not. Bell Labs had spent years building gun-directing radar systems, and that expertise in tracking and prediction turned out to be exactly what a guided missile program needed. The project was eventually named Sinanike, after the Greek goddess of victory, and its development followed a long, careful, unglamorous path that stretched across nearly a decade. The first unguided test firings happened in the fall of 1946. Simple proof that the rocket itself could fly reliably. Guidance systems, radar tracking, and computer-driven interception logic were refined through the rest of the decade, each piece tested separately before anyone tried combining them. Then, in October 1951, for the first time, every component of the system came together in a single missile, fired at the White Sands Range in New Mexico. The following month, on November 27, 1951, that missile achieved something no guided anti-aircraft weapon had ever done in the real world. It successfully intercepted a QB-17 drone, an unmanned former bomber over the New Mexico desert, proving in a live test what Wasserfall had never gotten the chance to prove in Germany. The system worked through what's called command guidance, and understanding it explains why it needed so many separate pieces working in sync. A ground-based radar would track the incoming target, feeding its position continuously to a computer on the ground. That same computer calculated the missile's own position through a second tracking radar, and using both sets of data, it would calculate an interception point and send steering commands to the missile by radio as it flew, correcting its course again and again until it reached the target's predicted location. Rather than needing to score a direct hit, the missile carried 3 conventional high-explosive warheads timed to detonate near the target automatically, close enough that a direct hit was never strictly necessary. It was, in essence, a flying artillery shell that could think, react, and adjust itself mid-flight, something no purely mechanical anti-aircraft gun could ever do. By January 1953, the first Nike battery and assembly area was operational at White Sands, and in December of that same year, the very first operational site was activated at Fort Meade, Maryland, close enough to Washington to matter. In 1954, the United States Army formally declared the system, now named Nike Ajax, the world's first operational guided surface-to-air missile system, and began deploying it around key American cities and military installations. Within a few years, there were nearly 200 Nike Ajax batteries ringing the country's most important urban centers, quietly standing guard against a Soviet bomber threat that thankfully never actually arrived. What makes this story even richer is that America wasn't alone in reaching this point, and it hadn't gotten there purely on its own either. When Germany fell in 1945, the unfinished Wasserfall program didn't simply vanish. Its research, its hardware, and in many cases its actual engineers were swept up by both the Americans and the Soviets in the closing months of the war, each side racing to grab what they could before the other did. American intelligence teams collected Wasserfall documentation and components as part of the broader effort that also brought von Braun's rocket team to the United States, feeding directly into ongoing American missile research. The Soviet Union, for its part, captured its own share of German engineers and hardware, and by 1955 had fielded its own guided surface-to-air missile system, the SA-1 Berkut, ringing Moscow with over 50 missile sites in a defensive belt built from a mixture of homegrown engineering and captured German expertise. 2 former enemies working from a shared, unfinished German blueprint, both arrived at a working anti-aircraft missile system within a few years of each other, each one convinced they were building something entirely their own. Nike Ajax, for all its success, still carried real limitations, and its very first major replacement followed the same pattern of improvement that seems to define every weapon in this history. Ajax ran on volatile liquid fuel that had to be loaded shortly before launch, a process that was slow, hazardous, and required constant, careful handling by trained crews working around missiles that were, quite literally, sitting on top of explosive propellant. That vulnerability wasn't theoretical. Engineers pushed forward with a solid-fueled successor, the Nike Hercules, introduced in 1958, which eliminated much of that fueling danger, extended the missile's range dramatically, and even carried the option of a nuclear warhead for engaging entire enemy bomber formations at once. From there, the underlying concept just kept spreading and evolving, eventually giving rise to the long lineage of modern surface-to-air missile systems that still ring cities and military installations around the world today. From the American Patriot system to Russia's S-300 family, all of them descendants in one way or another of a rocket that started life on a German test stand competing for funding against its own more famous, more destructive sibling. Which brings the story to an ending almost too fitting to be true. Nike Ajax and its Hercules successor stood on guard around American cities for 2 decades, waiting for a Soviet attack that never came, and by the time the missile program was finally phased out in the 1970s, replaced by newer defense priorities as intercontinental ballistic missiles made bomber defense less relevant, not a single Nike missile had ever been fired at an enemy aircraft over American soil, but that doesn't mean the program had no casualties. On May 22, 1958, at a Nike battery near Leonardo, New Jersey, ordnance technicians were performing a routine safety modification on one of the missiles when something went wrong. The explosion detonated 7 other missiles lined up alongside it, and the resulting blast killed 10 people, 6 American soldiers and 4 civilian workers, in what remains the deadliest accident in the entire history of the Nike program. The missiles built to defend American cities from an enemy that never came, never fired a shot in war. The only lives they ever actually took belonged to the very people who built and maintained them. It's a strange, quiet echo of where this story began. In Germany, a weapon built purely to defend was starved of resources in favor of one built purely to attack, and it never got the chance to save a single life. In America, its successor was built, funded, and deployed exactly as intended, stood ready for 2 decades, and never once fired at the enemy it was designed for, only to claim American lives anyway. Not through combat, but through the simple, mundane danger of maintaining a machine built to hold fire until the day it might be needed. Every weapon in this story was designed around the same basic promise, that it would protect the people who built it. Almost none of them ever got the chance to keep that promise in the way anyone actually intended.